Hello, my name is Dr. Joe Wysocki, and I'm the Dean of the Honors College at Belmont Abbey. Welcome to the Conversatio podcast. Today I'm joined with by my good friend, Dr. Josh Bowman, who is the Vice President of the Ciceronian Society, who received his PhD in politics from the Catholic University of America. Josh was gracious enough to host me on the Ciceronian Society's podcast a couple of months ago, The Sower. And so we're really excited to have him here to talk about a number of things, but especially because we're going to be hosting the Ciceronian Society's annual conference here at Belmont Abbey. So Joshua, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, before we begin, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey in terms of your learning and what brought you to the Ciceronian Society, anything we should know.
Yeah, I'm still learning. That's for sure. The journey towards my learning. I graduated from originally from Southeast Michigan, from Monroe, Michigan, which is where I was born and raised, and ended up at Lee University down in Cleveland, Tennessee. That's where I did my undergraduate and graduated there a while ago, and or at least so it seems. So I love the Southeast. I'm really excited to come back to North Carolina. And then I went to, we got married to Melissa. She and I went to Washington, D.C., very different from Southeast Tennessee. And I got my PhD in politics at the Catholic University of America in political philosophy. Ended up back in Michigan for a little bit, taught at LSU for 2 years after I finished the dissertation. And then ended up at Heidelberg University in Tiffin, Ohio for a few years, and am currently at Hope College in a temporary position that will conclude at the end of this spring 2023 semester, and then we'll see what happens after that. But Ciceronian Society started back in 2011. I was not there at the founding, but Peter Hallworth and a gang of some great scholars and people started off. Our first conference was at University of Virginia back in the day. I was unfortunately I was not there. I had never heard of it, but it was initially started because if you are a conservative or classical and especially a Christian scholar, and you want to advance in academia, you need peer-reviewed publications, you need conference appearances, you need a network, you need friends, and there's not a lot of friendly places for people like that. And so it was initially created as a kind of sanctuary for them. And I was certainly among those people as an early grad student. That's how I discovered it. So that's kind of where it started. Now we've made some changes and things have developed since then. But we'll talk more about that.
That's great. Yeah. I did not know that you came from Lee. As you mentioned, sort of friends who are the fellow seekers in this sort of space that you mentioned. I have great friends at Lee, and every year, they host a conference where I bring Honors College students. It's sort of interdisciplinary, intercollegiate conference. And every year we host a conference, and Lee always sends people here. It's a beautiful campus, and it seems like they're doing great things there too. So,
doing great things. Tom Pope, he's a great guy. He's doing a lot of good work there, as the other professors. And one of the people that recruited me into political science, Lee Cheek, who's a kind of a legend in that area. He's coming to this conference. I'm really excited. I haven't seen him in person in years, so really looking forward to seeing it. But he was at Lee when I was there, as a lot of other friends. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Great. Yeah. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about the conference maybe towards the end. But so the Ciceronian Society, dedicated to tradition, place, and things divine.
Yes.
I thought maybe we could just talk about those three things for a while, and we'll just start at the beginning and tradition. Why should people care about tradition? How is it different from nostalgia? Right? I mean, I think some people look at tradition, they go, "Oh, that's dad-like in commercials from the 1980s, and it's emotive, and it's the good old days, yearning for the good old days." So, but what is it about tradition that's so important that the Ciceronian Society places it, as
Right. Yeah. And I think part of this goes to the heart of what we're trying to do, and it's not just nostalgia, though I'm certainly guilty of that. There's a lot of things that the fights with technology I have all the time. I feel like it make me nostalgic for passenger pigeons and other ways of communicating that were more reliable. But for tradition for us, tradition's not simply a golden age we want to go back to. It's not simply loving that which is old and that which is, for its own sake necessarily. Although I think there's some value there. But tradition is something that we need to think. We are not simply born and starting over in a new story. We're born into a story that's already happening that we're a part of. And we need traditions to think through and navigate life, to understand ourselves, why we are the way we are, individually and as groups and as societies, politically. Edmund Burke's a good example here, where he admonished us to not abandon traditions, not try and start over. Look at tradition as the bank and capital of nations, as this great reservoir of resources, of wisdom, and of self-understanding that we could draw on, so we didn't have to constantly reinvent the wheel. If it's not broke, don't fix it. But tradition also helps us understand when things are broken. We've tried this before. We've gone down this road. It may not look exactly the same, but we don't want to go down there again. And so tradition is invaluable for what we're doing. Now, let me connect that a little bit better here. One of the things that is necessary for tradition is that it's transmitted, that it's passed down, and that we constantly revisit it. And one of the things that we focus on is trying to find ways to help homeschooling communities, classical school educators, as well as other faculty like yourself. How can we provide professional development and networking and resources that help you and others do that transmitting of the tradition from one generation to another? But also what we found, and this is actually another that is part of the origins of the Ciceronian Society. There's lots of thinkers in our tradition. I say our, I mean kind of Christian, Western, classical tradition, that have been forgotten. And how can we go back and recover some of those neglected thinkers and the ideas that we have just not paid attention to? And so we love seeing proposals and ideas, for example, like, hey, no one's read this book, but it's really, really valuable for understanding it. Hey, no one's looked at this thinker that this kind of obscure 19th century thinker. Let's go back and revisit what he or she said. And those are great opportunities. And so not only are we trying to preserve a tradition, we're also trying to recover traditions that we've lost.
Yeah, great. Well, a follow-up on tradition. Those students maybe, we both teach undergraduate students, and these students are coming from a sort of pluralistic society where, because there are so many traditions out there, that often leads to how do we pick? How do we choose one? And then a regime that we always talk about progress, and so they're sort of disposed to thinking in terms of progress being good. If they're coming to you as an undergraduate, any thoughts or tips about how do you sort of make that first inroad to get them to even sort of consider being open to tradition?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, there is a tradition of not being part of a tradition. Like they don't understand progress as rejecting traditions. One of the things in America, we sometimes think of ourselves as going out on our own, right? This kind of individualism, like we're going to just, the self-made person or the student who's like, I'm going to pick my own truth, if you will. None of us actually do that, in the sense that we can't reinvent language or material, our own world. And so I challenge the students who might say that and say, I'm not saying, that you need to accept my particular tradition. No one needs to do all that, because tradition is very diverse. It's not monolithic. It doesn't look the same everywhere you go. And that'll bleed into our conversation about place. But one of the things I challenge is like, okay, where are you getting these ideas that this is wrong, right? That you want to abandon this tradition, because you're actually probably drawing from another tradition to make that argument, right? In a sense, you can't escape tradition. The question is, what tradition are you loyal to, and have you been self-reflective about that? And that comes up in political philosophy a lot when people say, I in political philosophy, for example, I often say that Rousseau, for me, this is just my argument, that he's one of the most influential human beings in the last 200 years by far.
Yeah.
And I say, you've never heard of him, but he's in your head. I know he's in your head because what you're about to say to this question or this question is going to sound a lot like Rousseau, or actually more, just as frequently, John Stuart Mill.
Yep.
Have you ever read him either? Nope. Okay. And it's going to show up. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities there to point out you're living a tradition. It's not about rejecting tradition. It's about what tradition has its hold on you. And so that's usually what I.
No, that's great. That's great. Every time I teach Democracy in America by Tocqueville, he has these two chapters paired right next to each other at the beginning of volume 2, right, where he's the philosophic method of the Americans, where he says we're all Cartesians. So we're like Descartes, and we try to figure out everything on our own, and we won't accept any traditions. We're going to doubt everything. Right. And then the very next chapter, right, which is on the dogmatic beliefs of democratic peoples. And he says, look, everybody has dogmatic beliefs. Right after saying, like, Americans are Cartesians and they won't accept dogmatic beliefs, he says, but they're inescapable. And if you're not going to get them from the great books or from religion or from, your class, it's going to come from somewhere. In democracy, it's like it's public opinion, but it just sort of shows them, look, even if, as you said, we sort of have this tradition of rejecting tradition, but that's coming from somewhere, right? And that's a choice, even if it's maybe not a choice, but there are alternative choices, right? Yeah.
Right. And traditions aren't chains. There's something that connect us to our places, to our families, to the people we love. It's how we get a sense of ourselves and what we belong to and who we belong to. It's how we teach one another. And so I think I can't even imagine a life without tradition. As much as I used to think that. I mean, I'm very Protestant in some ways, and I think about how. I'm Protestant in more than just some ways. But I remember when I was younger and very immature, thinking about Catholics and thinking about Anglicans, which I am now. I don't want to go with those traditions. That's just stuffy and it's not free. I'm not freely expressing my faith. I mean, I just can't help but laugh at that thought. To me now, if I go to church and I participate in a liturgy, or I read the Book of Common Prayer, or even if I'm at a Catholic Mass, to me, I'm connected through those traditions to people thousands of years before me, and to those who come after me, and to the different places and communities that they're part of. To me, I don't feel less free participating in those traditions in that liturgy. I feel less alone.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. And that this is I'm part of something much larger than myself, and that is so countercultural to experience that and think of it. And I wish I wouldn't have rejected it for at least those few years and when I was younger and just not theologically sophisticated. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think that's a great segue into the sort of the second commitment of the Ciceronian Society, as you mentioned, sort of Catholic tradition. And it's so fitting in my mind that the Ciceronian Society come to be with us at Belmont Abbey because we're a Benedictine monastery. And unlike other religious orders, our monks take a vow of stability, whereas, other orders, mendicant orders, go out into the city, they go where they're called, they move around. These monks, they take a vow of stability and they're buried when they die in our cemetery here. And they, and so there's something really attractive about that's in the sort of air we breathe here at Belmont Abbey. But tell us a little bit about, the Ciceronian Society's commitment to place outside of, say, a religious community of monks. Why is place important for lay people, for our culture as a whole?
Yeah, I think of all the things that make us as the Ciceronian Society unique, I think this is the big one. I don't know of another organization that focuses on this the way we do. Now, I could be wrong, but I've never encountered it. And it's hard to describe in the abstract. It's precisely because what place means to me and what means to you is intentionally meant to be different. When I think of home, when I think of of rootedness, of where I'm supposed to be in this sense, it's naturally going to be different depending on who you are. But I think place gets us to this notion of particularity, that the particular is not a problem, if that makes sense. It almost goes back to a Plato and Aristotle type debate, depending on how you read him. Thinking of Plato is thinking of, there's the form of the good, but Aristotle teaching us that it's the particular good, the true and the beautiful, that points us toward the universal true and the good, true and the beautiful. That's one way to think of it. And to me, whatever is good, lovely, whatever is divine, whatever happiness is, whatever joy is, whatever all these different universal goods and virtues, they're going to manifest themselves in an infinite number of ways, and in very particular places, especially beauty, I think. And we want to celebrate that. It's not that we want to come impose in your classical school or your homeschool or your university a particular sense of what beauty is or what the virtues necessarily are. There is a universal sense of this, but that what this is going to look like where you are is going to be different than what it looks like over here. And so I think that particularity is really, really important to celebrate, because it celebrates genuine diversity, and that we don't have to conform to everything. We want to conform ourselves to the Word of God, to the teachings of the church, and to this tradition, yes, but not at the expense of particular places and lifestyles, if you will. I mean, there's orthodoxy, there's boundaries, and there's these rules that we live by. But at the same time, we want that town to look differently, that church to look differently in a way that I think is valuable. And I'm having a hard time explaining this, because what place means is not universal. So right now I live in Holland, Michigan. And when I think of Holland, Michigan, I think of very specific things. I think of the Tulip Festival, and I think of windmills and its Dutch heritage, and the fact that it has the largest municipal snowmelt system in the world, where basically right now it's snowing, and it melts as soon as it hits the ground, because it does. They have a system. And I think of the people here. I think of certain restaurants. I think of certain stores, local stores and traditions. And that's what I mean by a sense of place, that we don't, and I would juxtapose, and it may be helpful to juxtapose this with what we are not. I think right now there's a tendency toward rootlessness, toward kind of always trying to escape from a place, toward disparaging the local and the particular. And I don't think that's healthy. I think there's something that we love and we don't necessarily just mean local rural areas. Those are wonderful, but also that particular city block, that particular neighborhood within a city, and that we think about ourselves as part of that economy, part of that place. I think that's part of what we're going for. And we have an award for that at the conference. So someone will receive a award for a paper reflecting on the notion of place at every conference. And we hope to expand our scholarship there. Actually, a lot of the papers for this particular conference, probably more so than any other conference, are focused on place this time. And so if you want to get a better sense of what it means than what I'm trying to say, come to the conference. Yeah. We have a lot of great people talking about it.
How do you train the affections of people to love place and to commit to having roots? I mean, for Tocqueville, this always seems to be such a threat, right? He says, like, the independence and the vitality of the township, for example, right? Which he thinks is so great in American, political life. It's always under threat, because large organizations have more money and they can say we do things more efficiently. And well, diversity and people doing things in their little backward ways, that's not the best way to do it. And with an internet that shows you, well, you can do it this way. I don't know if I have a great question here, except, even Wendell Berry, it's interesting. We did at Lee last year, we read one of Wendell Berry's novels, Hannah Coulter, and, her sons go off to college. They go off to college, and,
right. Yeah.
Part of college in a way is getting you to, be more cosmopolitan in a certain sense, reading these things you never would have read and having these experiences you wouldn't have read. And then she's sad that her son doesn't want to come back home and live in Fort William. And so, I don't know if you've thought about, the threats to that, and how do you sort of make the case or show people the good, how place is related to flourishing for human beings.
Yeah, I think that is very much a tough
Yeah.
one, because we have to. It is whatever the answer to that question is countercultural, because we recognize that it's going to be we're going to be resisted. I also think of when you talk about Hannah Coulter, but also I think it was he gave a commencement speech. Wendell Berry did on like a homecoming, I think it was called. Basically, what if we got degrees and went home, right? And contributed to that, because there's and part of that is this belief that we go to college and we get an education to make money and to do something for ourselves. That the whole purpose of our education is to do something that's going to make us wealthier, us successful. I think if there's one thing I would change, and I was guilty of that. If I were to give a commencement speech, for example, I think one of the biggest things I would point out, and Barry points this out as well, is you're educated and you're developed to help and serve others, not to help and serve humanity in general in this kind of abstract sense, but to help particular people. Now that may not be back home, but it very well might be, because you're from there, you understand those people, and you can go back. Now, how do we train them? One of the things I hope to come out of the Ciceronian Society over time is to answer this question, is to think about how can we come together and share ideas and share experiences of how we're doing this. I think homeschooling and classical schooling are amazing examples of this, because in order to successfully offer a classical education, and especially for homeschooling, you use the place that you're in to educate your kids, right? We're going to start homeschooling next year, and we're thinking like, okay, how are we going to use this museum that's downtown? How are we going to use the parks around us? How are we going to use these different examples here to teach our kids math and science and history and all this other stuff? And I think that's invaluable. I also think it's valuable to experience other places. I think when I went to, gosh, it's almost 17 years ago now. When I was at Lee, they had a semester in Europe program. It was amazing. It's probably one of the most life-changing experiences of my ever. And I loved everything I saw in Europe, right? We went all over England, Ireland, Scotland, and the mainland. And the particularities of the places we visited did not have to make me long for those places necessarily. But when I came home, I remember thinking, I see architecture differently. I see the food I'm eating differently. I'm seeing the way that the city's laid out. I thought of that differently, right? You go to old Europe, everything revolves around what? The church, except for the new town, which revolves around usually a government or a business. And I thought to myself, like my own hometown, which was founded in the late 18th, early 19th century. At first, it revolved around the church, one of the oldest Catholic church in Michigan, actually. But then it would eventually revolve more around the businesses, the paper mills, and eventually the auto factories. But I think to myself about how experiencing other places with the right guide, the right way, teaches you to love your own place more. And so I don't, I think coming together and learning, what are you doing down at Belmont? What is so-and-so doing over at Lee, right? Over in Cleveland? What is so-and-so doing over, down in Atlanta? I think that's invaluable for asking their better questions and experiencing place more intimately and deeply.
Yeah. Great. Wonderful. For those of our listeners who aren't familiar with Wendell Berry, who we were waxing on about, he is an author of both fiction. He has an entire series about this one town. He's a Kentucky author, but also writes a number of really interesting essays on everything from farming to community to economics. So, yeah. Well, good. Yeah. We'll just move on to the last commitment of the Ciceronian Society, things divine. And my question here might be, how do we approach that in a sort of religiously pluralistic society? How do you sort of commit to that substantively when there's so much diversity in terms of religious commitments? And what does that mean to you guys?
Yeah, there's a lot to say here. And one of the goofy things about us is we're called the Ciceronian Society. Cicero was not a Christian. Right. I think, and I could be wrong about this, I think he actually invented the word religion. But he he saw the value of religion, even if he didn't necessarily believe it entirely, in some cases, as this ordering force of understanding the world in a way. But I think of Christianity in particular as completing what classical thought started, as basically classical thought and reason. And one of the reasons why we still read people like Plato and Aristotle and Aeschylus and whoever, that we see them reaching for something that is completed in Christ. Now, when we say things divine is a phrase taken from Cicero, right. But he emphasized, but he never gets to the full answer. Right? He's still a pagan. Obviously, he dies before Christ is ever born. But we see that what makes the primary tradition that we draw on, what makes place sacred, is this religious tradition and the religious teachings that we draw. We don't want. We are deliberately and explicitly Christian, ecumenical in that sense. We're Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and they will all be there.
Yeah,
I know that because I have to do the catering for Friday during Lent,
yes.
right? And talking to our friends at Belmont about that. It was so funny just trying to think of here's the Protestant salad with chicken on it, right? And here's the we're going to have fish on Friday night. And so it's thinking about all that stuff as an Anglican was kind of funny. But it's also great. These traditions are wonderful. But I don't think we can find, and maybe this is controversial, I don't think we could be held together as well as a society, as a group, as Ciceronian Society, simply by another ideology, even by a particular place, or even by a particular philosophy, or even just by an affection for Cicero, which we all have, by a particular thinker. I think the deepest friendships are those rooted in a common love of Christ and of the Word of God, and of the church. And I think that what we have found is that in order to develop a society that wants to help, where we as a society want to help one another, love one another rightly, and love our families and our places and our communities and our churches and our schools rightly, it will be more successful. It will be deeper if we center it in Christ, in prayer, in the Christian tradition. Because all our work as academics, as educators, as publishers, as writers, as thinkers, it will only go so far. We need the grace of God, and the whole Thomistic Aquinas notion that grace perfects nature, I think, is deeply embedded in what we're doing. Grace perfects tradition, perfects place, it perfects our education, it perfects our writing. When you go back and read something you wrote and it's better than what you thought it was, you realize, thanks God, because I didn't do that on my own. And I think if we're gonna these themes that we focus on, and the broader mission, behind the Ciceronian Society of developing local communities and a society that helps one another educate the next generation and educate each other. Yeah. And this intellectual discipleship is the word I use. We need a lot of grace for that, and I think without it, we're done. We're only going to get so far, and we're going to get burned out. And so grace is necessary for all of it.
Thank you so much. We're so excited about the conference coming because as I look through the panels, I go, man, there are going to be some incredible conversations, incredible opportunities for learning. A number of the Honors College students are planning on coming. We have a lot of the Abbey faculty who are just planning to come. Some as discussants, others just to be part of the conversations. Tell me a little bit. Maybe I'll force you to be controversial. Is there a panel you are looking forward to the most as you went through that?
Yes. Let me think here. I'm just kidding. I mean, I'm not on any of them, so I can't be selfish here. I mean, one of the worst things about this. I mean, let me start. There's so many wonderful things about the conference. Yeah. The only bad thing is you can't go to all the panels, right, because we're going to have to do different streams. Because I'm thinking to myself, I want to go to all of these. And I'm not just saying that. Right. I mean, we have created a conference that we all want to go to. But the problem is we can't go to all of it all the time. I am, one of the first panels that got proposed was a panel on Tolkien. Yeah. and I love Tolkien. So I'm really excited about that one. We got some other ones here though that I'm also really excited about. There's on Friday morning, there's a author meets critics panel that's sponsored by the Institute for Human Ecology, the Lumen Christi Institute, and the Nova Forum for Catholic Thought. And we're going to be discussing Jason Blakely's book, We Built Reality, which is a critique of social science in the 20th century and how it has become a kind of version of scientism. Yep. I just finished that book yesterday. I am ridiculously excited for this conversation. I want to recommend, if you've never read Blakely's book, it is provocative in all the right ways. It is a really, really good conversation starter. And we got several amazing people on that panel that are going to have a good conversation. Right after that, the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy has been a big supporter of us. They just did a project on the religious liberty in the states. And so looking at how individual states rank in terms of how they recognize religious liberty. That project is just getting started. They kind of published their first report this past year, I believe in September. Right. And that was led by Sarah Estelle, who's going to be here. She's going to be talking about it, and there'll be several people discussing it. We have other panels on one on the work of George Grant. Speaking of a neglected thinker, especially in American thought, we're going to be talking about him. There's a panel with the folks, your neighbors over at the Circe Institute on Socratic teaching. Right. They're going to be coming by. We have panels on farming, farming and faith. Where else are you going to find that, right? You see that, of course, there's a lot of overlap, especially from the very beginning with what we do with the Front Porch Republic people. And I think you'll see that here. We'll see stuff from Shakespeare and of course on Cicero, also Abraham Kuyper, Augustine. There's so many fun things we're going to talk about. And of course, the best conversations usually happen over the food, which is usually, honestly, if I'm going to say what I'm most excited about, it's that. We're going to have some barbecue because, speaking of sacrament, that's how I experience it. Sacred barbecue.
Right. Yeah. I stopped going to sort of academic disciplinary conferences many years ago. I'm sure there are some out there that are maybe worth going to, but these are the types of conferences that I just love the idea of Belmont Abbey hosting and going, because ultimately we're talking about human flourishing in a really comprehensive way. And I just go, like my students, I'm going, you got to come to this. There are going to be really bright people here talking about economics and talking about literature, and it's all, it's rooted in Christ. It's rooted in a care for tradition, for soul craft. We're all thinking about education in terms of soul craft, and it's going to be such a delight. Well, good. Let's see. We're kind of coming to the end of our time. Let's maybe just sort of remind people the conference is March 9th through 11th here at Belmont Abbey College, and the website, if they want to register, what is that again, Joshua?
That is CiceronianSociety.org, Ciceronian Society.org. And I'm sure I don't know if you have show notes or not, but go ahead and put it in there. You can register to the website. That'll also give you the schedule for the conference, tell you about, if you're coming from a distance where you can stay, got blocks at 2 hotels locally. Closest airport is Charlotte. And it's pretty easy to get to. And we're working on getting some shuttles so we can get people between the hotels and campus. And I know there's ride sharing and stuff you can use to get from the airport to the hotels. We'll have hospitality activities in the evenings as well. And so there's going to be a lot of time to socialize, connect with people, put together different ideas about writing projects. There's been entire books and symposiums and courses that have come out of a Ciceronian Society conference because it's small enough to where you're going to meet everybody there, right, and you're going to get to know them really, really well. And if you're a student, a graduate student or an undergraduate student, you're earlier in your career, this is just invaluable. You're not going to get lost in a crowd like you will at a thing like an APSA conference, for example. You're going to get to know some really amazing people, and it's going to be a great experience.
That's great. And yeah, just to reiterate, this is worth coming to, even if you're not presenting, right?
Oh yeah, exactly, right.
I got pulled into a panel, and I was kind of like, oh, now I got to do work. I was happy to just sit and listen to everybody else, but no, I'm excited. I'm very excited about my panel as well. But So show up. Well, good. Any last words or thoughts you want to leave us with, Josh?
Yeah, I'll leave with this. I just want to thank you and Belmont Abbey so much for helping us with this conference. It would not be possible without you. This was such an obvious choice for us to visit. Joe and the Honors College, y'all have just been amazing in terms of support for us. And we're going to have a hard time leaving, I think, on that Sunday. So I just want to invite anyone and everyone who's interested in this. Let us know. You can contact me, info@ciceroniansociety.org. We're an all-volunteer organization. We're looking for all the support we can get, and we do a lot with a little, which is our specialty, if you will. And the sky's the limit, though. We have a lot of great plans going forward. There's a lot of ways we can serve the church and classical schools and homeschooling. And if you want to be a part of that conversation, and get it on the ground floor, if you will, and see where can we take this as a society and as a community. This is a great opportunity to be a part of that. Because I think there's a lot of opportunities. The classical school world is growing. The homeschooling world is growing. Places like Belmont and other places, they're growing and doing great. Why? Because we're onto something. And if you want to be part of that conversation and what happens next, please, we'll see you in North Carolina.
Great. Well, thanks again, Josh. And to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the Conversatio podcast. If you liked this episode, check out, we are now in season 2. And so we have over 10 episodes, and you can find it anywhere that you go to for your favorite podcasts. Thank you, and God bless. We hope to see you in March.